Hey everyone, it's Andrea Walford here for Simon Says Stamp. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to create this Praying for You card, which features exclusive Simon Says Stamp products and demonstrates two different techniques. How to create a faux wood grain effect using your dye ink pads, and how to create a watercolor resist using Tim Holtz distress stains on a background built out of a sentiment stamp, then heat embossed. So I started off with a 4x5¼ piece of Ranger Ink Essentials watercolor paper. I adhered it to my grid paper using a little bit of Dotto adhesive, which is a temporary removable adhesive. I then made a pencil mark as a reference point in the top left corner, and then with an acrylic graph ruler and a pencil, I started creating diagonal lines moving from that reference point towards the bottom right corner. Now the diagonal lines are at 1/2 inch increments, and you'll notice that I'm not actually doing them on the watercolor paper itself, and that's because I didn't want to have to worry about erasing lines or having them potentially show up underneath my embossed sentiment. So my next step was to rub an anti-static bag all over the surface of my watercolor paper and start building my background using the Praying for You sentiment that comes from the Simon Says Stamp hand-lettered encouragement stamp set. Now I mounted it onto an acrylic block that had grid lines so I could align those with my hand-drawn lines. So I stamped my first sentiment with Versamark ink and then sprinkled on white embossing powder before moving on to the next line, simply because it's very hard to see Versamark against a white background. And I would do about 3 lines at a time and then heat it with my heat tool before continuing on down my cardstock. Now once I got to about the 4th line there, the actual length that I had to stamp across the cardstock was longer than the sentiment itself. So I had to stamp the sentiment twice along the line, and in some cases, for the even longer ones when I was more on a diagonal, I'd have to stamp the sentiment 3 times. Each time though, I'd have to follow the same process, stamp in my Versamark, add my embossing powder before stamping the next image in Versamark, simply so that I could make sure that I was positioning the sentiments accurately going all the way across my lines. So now there you can see what my piece looks like now that it's been completely embossed. So now for my faux wood grain technique, I took a scrap piece of my 120-pound Simon Says Stamp white cardstock and started dragging 4 different colors of my Simon Says Stamp dye inks across it. Now, I started with my lightest color, working my way up to my darkest. So I started with Fog and then moved on to Fossil, to Cobblestone, and I finished off with Khaki just to warm it up a little bit. And for each ink pad, I didn't want to get a solid coverage of cardstock. I wanted those lines that you see when you're looking at a piece of wood, so hence the faux wood grain. And to get those lines, what I did was I held my ink pad at slightly under a 45-degree angle. So the top of the pad was touching the paper and then the bottom was angled up in the air, and then I just very lightly dragged it across my cardstock piece. Now to get more defined lines, what I would then do is, still holding my ink pad at the same angle, I would tilt it a little bit to the left. So I was dragging the left edge of the ink pad very lightly down across the cardstock piece. And there you can see how beautifully that created those lines. And I did layer the colors from lightest to darkest, but then I went back and added more as I felt it needed it. Now once I had gotten my cardstock piece to the look that I wanted, I then took my largest cross die from the Crosses die, and that's another Simon Says Stamp product, and I just held my die in place on my cardstock with some removable tape, and I just looked for, or made sure that my edges of my die were aligned with my wood grain lines, and then I die cut it. So in order to add a little contrast around the edges and a little dimension, I decided to add some sponging with a sponge dauber and my Simon Says Stamp khaki dye ink. So I simply pounced my sponge dauber on my ink pad and then started on the grid paper, and working in a circular motion, I sponged the ink all around the perimeter of my cross. Now after I finished sponging with the khaki ink, I was finding that I still didn't have the level of contrast that I wanted, and I also wanted to warm it up just a little bit. So I grabbed some of my Tim Holtz brushed corduroy distress ink and my same sponge dauber and started sponging around the perimeter of the cross, and then slowly started bringing the color to the inside of the cross as well, just very lightly. So I set my cross aside and then took my stamped and embossed background paper and taped it with some painter's tape to my Ranger nonstick craft sheet. I then grabbed a mop style paintbrush and just some plain water and just lightly brushed the surface of my paper in the area that I knew I wanted to contain the color. Now for my color, I was using the Ranger Mustard Seed Distress Stain, and I did mix it with a little bit of water to dilute the color a little bit, and then brushed it in the area that I had previously applied water to. Now once I had done that, I then came back and applied some more Distress Stain, but this time didn't water it down. I just dipped my paintbrush directly into the Distress Stain and started brushing it around the outer perimeter of my area there, because I wanted to create more of a contrast between the edges and the center area. Now once I had finished applying my watercolor wash onto my watercolor paper, I set that aside to air dry and then grabbed a scrap piece of the Simon Says Stamp Dark Chocolate cardstock. And I used that to die cut my sentiment Praying for You, which is another Simon Says Stamp craft die. And as you can see, I put a layer of wax paper in between the die and the cardstock and then die cut it with my Big Shot. And what the wax paper does is help it pop out smoothly, so you don't have to be picking your sentiment out of the die. So with all the individual elements of my card ready, it was now time to start assembling it. So to stick my cross onto my stamped embossed and watercolored piece, I took some of my Tombow Mono multi-liquid glue and put a thin line of it down the center of the cross, and then I stuck it directly to the center of that watercolor paper piece. Now when you're working with die cut sentiments that have fine lines like this one, it can be a little bit of a challenge to stick them down to your card, simply because the lines themselves are so fine that it becomes hard to apply glue directly to the back and not have it come squishing out when you then go to stick that onto your card. So one of my favorite techniques is to take a little bit of my Tombow Mono multi-liquid glue and apply it to a piece of palette paper. And that has a slick, non-porous surface. So you can also alternately use wax paper. And then I press my die cut into the glue and then very carefully pick it up with my tweezers and stick it to my card. And because the glue has been spread to such a thin layer on my palette paper, you don't end up with an overwhelming amount of glue on the back, but you actually have just enough to hold that piece down in place on your card. So at this point, I'm ready to stick my panel to my card base, and I've created an A2 size card out of my 120-pound Simon Says Stamp white cardstock and applied it with 3-dimensional foam tape. And then my final step was to add a scattering of small pearls just to embellish it. So there you have it. That's how I created my card. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial, and I look forward to stamping with you again.